Good evening. Welcome to the final Crossroads of Ideas of 2016. We're delighted to have you, all of you who are willing to brave the cold to hear more about the election that we are still in the process of understanding. My name is Laura Heisler. I am the Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and also the Director of Outreach for the Morgridge Institute for Research. So I represent two of the three entities housed in this Discovery building, the third being the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. We have all come together, all three organizations that live and work in this building, to create this Crossroads of Ideas series with the idea that this space that you're in here in the town center was always intended to be a crossroads of ideas across the campus and connecting the campus and the community. And with this series, what we try to do is bring you conversations and discussions on issues that are important to all of us in our lives that also happen to be the subject of groundbreaking research here at UW-Madison. This semester, we have chosen to focus on issues related to the 2016 elections. We will be taking a different approach, looking at a variety of issues in the spring semester. If you're on our mailing list and got an email about this session, we'll keep you apprised of the sessions that we develop for the spring. If you aren't and you would like to be, we do have a sign-up list right outside the door, so please do let us know how to reach you if you're interested in being connected. You can also always find these events on the discovery.wis.edu page. And for this series, we'll always run an ad in the Isthmus the week before, so you can look for that as well if you're interested in this series. A couple housekeeping notes before I turn things over to our speaker. We do record all of these sessions. You can find the videos on the discovery.wis.edu site within a couple of days. Because we record the talks, we like to capture the questions that you'll have during the question and answer period on the microphones. So if you would raise your hand when we get to the Q&A and let one of the mic runners reach you before starting to ask your question, that would be much appreciated. We're going to have our speaker call on people as he sees the questions materialize. So he'll be talking for about 40 to 45 minutes or so, leaving a good 10 to 15 minutes for your questions, and I'm sure he'll stick around for a few minutes afterwards if you didn't get a chance to ask yours during the Q&A. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce Barry Burden. He's Professor of Political Science and Director of the Elections Research Center and the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics here at UW-Madison. His research and teaching focus on U.S. elections, public opinion, representation, and the U.S. Congress. His recent research has centered on aspects of election administration and voter participation. He's the author of Personal Roots of Representation, co-editor with Charles Stewart of The Measure of American Elections, co-author with David Kimball of Why Americans Split Their Tickets, and editor of Uncertainty in American Politics. Burden has published articles in journals such as the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, British Journal of Political Science, Public Opinion Quarterly, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and Election Law Journal. He earned his PhD at The Ohio State University and was a faculty member at Harvard before joining UW-Madison in 2006. He's co-founder of the Election Administration Project and is also affiliated with the La Follette School of Public Affairs and the Center for Demography of Health and Aging. And he's part of the host committee for the 2017 meeting of the Society for Political Methodology. I think he's going to be a very busy man in the next few years trying to understand this recent election, and we couldn't have a better person to talk to us about the science of the gender gap in the 2016 election. So with that, please help me welcome Barry Burden.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for the introduction, Laura. Thanks to all of you for not booing when you heard I got my PhD at Ohio State. I always appreciate that. And for choosing me over President-elect Donald Trump, who's speaking just down the road 90 minutes east of here right now. So I appreciate your attendance here. I'm going to try to bring some science to understanding how gender affected the 2016 elections. Gender was all over the place in these elections, and so I won't be able to cover every aspect. But I think there are some areas both in thinking about the gender gap in voting and in reactions to Hillary Clinton as the first female presidential candidate on a major party ticket that we can use some of the tools of social science to help understand. I should note that this research is joint work with several co-authors, collaborators. One is Yoshikuni Ono, who has been a driving force behind some of the experiments you're going to see in a few moments. And I've also been working with two of our graduate students, Mike DiCrescenzo and Evan Crawford, on some of the work on the gender gap. So I only take credit for the good parts of the projects here tonight. All right, so let's think about gender in 2016. This was set up to be an election where gender was going to be maybe a defining feature. There were stories like these throughout the early parts of the primaries and into the summer campaign, anticipating that a battle between Hillary Clinton, if she were the Democratic nominee, and Donald Trump, if he became the Republican nominee, would open up a gulf between the sexes. And there would be a gender gap as large as the Grand Canyon if they were the two nominees. And in fact, the opening image tonight looks like it has a Grand Canyon in the background, so I appreciated that. That's not exactly what happened in the end. Despite those expectations, the gender gap in voting has been a fairly constant factor since about the early 1980s. And this year was a large gender gap. Some have said the largest, at least in the modern survey era, but not a Grand Canyon, not a gulf of the size people were expecting. There was no gender gap before about 1980. You'll see in 1976, according to exit polls, men and women voted identically. And it was really in 1980 that women moved away from the Republican Party, or men moved toward it, and a gap emerged in that election, we think having something to do with Ronald Reagan's candidacy. Since that time, the gap has widened a bit, but it's been fairly steady at around 10 points on average. This year was slightly larger than the last election at about 13 percentage points for what the exit polls have to say. So it's surprising, I think, to many that the gap was not bigger this year. And that's partly what we're going to try to make sense of. I should note that around the time the gap emerged in the early 80s, it was also about the time that women's voting rates began to exceed those of men. Women have long been more numerous in the population. They live longer than men do, but they also began voting at higher rates in the 1980s. So not only did this gap emerge, but there were differential participation rates that you might think would advantage Democratic candidates. So that's not always the way it works out. Some of you would have seen these stories on the website 538 back in October when Hillary Clinton was riding high in the polls. One was a simulation of what the Electoral College map would have looked like if only men voted in the 2016 election. You can see lots of red states. There are just a few places where men are Democratic enough that if they had voted, Clinton would have won, mostly on the coast. And in contrast, if only women had voted in the 2016 election, just about all of the states outside the Deep South would have gone blue. It turned out that the actual map was closer to the one on the left than the one on the right. Trump won 306 electoral votes compared to that prediction of 350. So somewhere along the way, neither of these things quite came to fruition, and it's something we need to try to make sense of. The opening graphic you saw had a man and a woman with their backs to one another. And I think that highlights something important about the gender gap. It's a demographic cleavage that is different from other demographic cleavages. When we say that black voters and white voters, or old voters and young voters, have different voting preferences, that's understandable. Those people are often living in different places. Men and women, in contrast, are mixing with one another and living in the same household, often married to one another. So how can it be that men's and women's preferences are so different and yet they're able to coexist in the same household? Part of it is that we lie to ourselves about what our spouse's preferences actually are. This is a wonderful survey done back in October that asked men and women who they intended to vote for. Those are the columns on the left. And so you can see that men were leaning towards Donald Trump by about 18 points at the time. Women were leaning towards Hillary Clinton by about 5 points, so familiar gender gap. And then the questions on the right ask, who do you think your spouse will vote for? And you can see that there's some misinformation about people's spouses. Men on the left, 31% said they would vote for Hillary Clinton, and when asked who their spouses would vote for, the percentages were pretty similar. So men were under the impression that their wives were essentially voting the way they were for the most part. Women also had some misperceptions, but not quite as extreme as the men's. So part of the way this cleavage manages to maintain itself and we coexist is that we don't quite see one another's actual vote intentions the way they really are. There's a second question that gets asked sometimes. Does the gender gap help one party or the other? There's a lot of popular speculation that a bigger gulf between men and women helps the Democrats. And in fact, the Democratic Party has sometimes pursued campaign strategies designed to increase the women's vote. and Republicans have sometimes been alarmed when the gender gap gets too large that they're now running behind in some way and need to make that up by going after the women's vote. That turns out not to be much of a relationship, it turns out. What I have here for the same set of elections I showed you earlier from the exit polls, the size of the gender gap along the x-axis. So further to the right means bigger voting differences between men and women. On the left, smaller differences. And then the share of the vote won by the Democrat in that election. And there's not much of a relationship, particularly if you take out the 1984 landslide, which is kind of an outlier on this figure. There's zero correlation between the two. In a retrospect, that makes some sense. Why would a larger gender gap help one party or the other? A larger gap could mean that more women are moving towards the Democratic Party, and that could be helpful to Democratic candidates. But it could also mean that men are moving towards the Republican Party, and that would be harmful to Democratic candidates. So that single number just doesn't have all the information we need to make sense of how the voting patterns of men and women translate to election outcomes. Notice also 2016 is on the figure, and it's right on the regression line. Nothing unusual about this. The gap is bigger than in other elections, but not wildly so. And the relationship between that and the vote share, which turned out to be around 51% for Clinton of the two-party vote, also not very far off the scale. That's going to be a theme I come back to in a moment, the normality of this election, given all the things that seem so abnormal and nutty about it. In the end, it adhered mostly to patterns we'd expect. One of the things we expect is to be able to forecast the outcomes of elections well in advance. This is something that sort of cottage industry has developed around in political science. There are now a number of academics who use forecasting models to predict the outcomes of upcoming elections. And they do it weeks or sometimes months in advance without even knowing who the nominees are, without even knowing what the issues are, or what the conventions will be like, or how the debates will go. And it turns out that just knowing some basic structural information about the state of the economy, the approval rating for the president, some other factors, does a pretty good job of predicting election outcomes. So in 2016, these modelers went to work just the way they have in other recent elections. This is a summary of their projections. You see the names of the forecasting team on the left, what they called their models. They all have different ideas about what variables ought to be important. When they made the prediction, some of them did it a couple of months before the election, some half a year before the election. Their projection, and then how far their projection was from the actual election outcome, at least as far as we knew it at the time this figure was produced. And you can see that most of them were fairly close to what actually happened. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 2 percentage points. Most of these projections are within 1 or 2 percentage points, closer than most of the polls, or I think many of us were expecting. Through much of the campaign, actually, these forecasts were discounted as being unrealistic, that the Democrats were going to win the election easily, and now these folks have been vindicated. Those factors turn out to be pretty important, despite the fact that we had really two unusual nominees. The first female candidate ever nominated by a major party, and Donald Trump, who had a background in business, reality television, and other places, really unusual candidate in lots of ways. Despite those things, these background conditions, economics, presidential approval, and so on, do a pretty good job of predicting elections. So the election outcome looks quite normal by those standards. Let me show you what some of these indicators look like. Here are two that commonly get used in these models. On the left-hand side, you have presidential approval ratings from June of the election year. So these are from questions asking people, do you approve or disapprove of the way the president is handling his job as president? That's obviously a good predictor of election outcomes. People who are happy with the incumbent administration often vote for the candidate of that party. So again, you see the regression line connecting those things pretty tightly. So in years like 1956 or 1996, when the president has high approval ratings, his party does well in elections. When his approval rating is underwater, like in 1992, Republicans did worse that year. Again, 2016, right on the regression line, nothing peculiar about it, even given the unusual candidates. On the right-hand side, we have another indicator. This is growth in the gross domestic product in the second quarter of the election year, measured in percentages. So 5 would be a growth of 5 percentage points. Again, incumbent parties do well when growth is positive. People like to see the economy improving. They're penalized when it's doing poorly. And 2016 is right on the regression line. Nothing peculiar. You wouldn't know. that 2016 was an unusual campaign if I showed you only these figures. Even the polling throughout the campaign indicated a pretty placid set of events. I think we remember it as a crazy 12 months or a crazy 16 months from the time Trump first rode down that escalator in Trump Tower until November 8th. Debates, revelations, scandalous things coming out of his tweets and elsewhere. The polls don't show it. The polls show relative stability, more stability than in the 2012 election. It's difficult to see any effects of the events we remember. The debates come and go. The only obvious wiggles in the lines, are right here. This is when the two party conventions happened. This is the improvement that the Republicans get from having their national convention in Cleveland, and then the Democrats were the next week in Philadelphia, and they get a bump out of their convention. So there's a little bit of back and forth here, but after that, it's basically the pattern that we were in before, and it carries through most of the campaign. There is a dip here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. This is around the debates and the release of the Access Hollywood tape. But again, those didn't have the monstrous effects that I think many people expected them to have. The only thing that was a little different this year are actually these lines. There were many more people who were undecided in 2016 than in other recent elections, and more people considering votes for third parties than we had seen since the mid-1990s. And in the end, the polls actually did a pretty good job of predicting the election outcome. The average by the end of this pollster time series is about 3.8 percentage points. It looks like Clinton is going to win the popular vote by a little more than 2 percentage points, maybe 2.5 by the time California is done counting. Well within the margin of error, nothing exceptional. The polls were no farther off at this level than they were in 2012. In fact, they were more accurate in 2016 than in 2012. There were plenty of places the polls got it wrong, largely in Wisconsin and other states in the Midwest. That was backwards from what we expected. I think a lot of us thought that the state polls were of higher quality and would be more accurate, and the national polls less so, but it turns out to be just the opposite. So again, a lot of normality here, despite the fact that gender dynamics and other factors were so different this time around. So let's have a look at the gender gap. This is the gap from the exit polls this year. So women, as I mentioned, are a larger share of voters, 53%, and they voted disproportionately for Hillary Clinton, 54% to 41% among men. But this cross-tabulation disguises a lot of differences in the electorate that are important to understand. For example, there also is a marital gap, a marriage gap between those who are married and those who are not. And it turns out to be only married men who are strongly Republican, and very much so. 57% of them voted for Donald Trump, and they're almost 30% of the electorate. But married women were roughly equally divided. Unmarried men actually went for Clinton, and unmarried women, almost 2/3 of them voted for Clinton. This has become a very strong demographic base for Democratic candidates. So much of the gender gap is in fact a marriage gap. But there's also a relationship between gender and race. So here we have the breakdown by both sex and race. There are two groups that Trump won: white men, where he did exceptionally well, almost 2/3 of the vote, and white women, where he won a majority, just over 50%. But in all these other categories, African American men and women, Latino men and women, Clinton was victorious. So, and these gaps are bigger than the gender gaps in the first table. So it becomes apparent that race is just much more important as a predictor of the vote than is gender. Men and women are important because they're large blocks and roughly equal sized blocks in the electorate. But when it comes to knowing how a person will vote, knowing a person's sex is not as informative as knowing whether they're white, black, Latino, or something else. And then finally, there's partisanship. This now mixes sex with a person's party. These two blocks are people who will call themselves Democrats, men and women, overwhelmingly voting for Clinton. No real gender gap there. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. If you're a Democrat, you're voting for Hillary Clinton. Here are Republicans. Again, doesn't matter if you're male or female. There's no gender gap here. This is just Republicans voting for the Republican candidate. The interesting one for election outcomes are these two. The independents, independent men, overwhelmingly on, well, at least solidly on Trump's side, independent women on Clinton's side. But again, the larger gap here is between parties. This is a massive gulf. 90% of Democrats on one side, 90% of Republicans on the other, regardless of their gender. All of this says it's going to be difficult for gender to play a very large role in an election when you have these other variables that are so powerful. When partisanship is explaining 90% of what voters do, and race and ethnicity and other factors explaining so much, there just is not a lot left over for gender to account for. In fact, if you compare the gender gap just to really any other gap in the exit polls, there's the gender gap at the top. It's noticeable. It's larger than in previous elections, but it doesn't compare to racial differences and ethnic differences. It doesn't even compare to the generation gap between the young and the old. It's not even as large as this educational gap where now people with postgraduate degrees have become much more democratic, and I could go down the list. Right? So it's not at the top of the list in terms of important markers in society, and yet I think it's an important one because of the sizes of the groups and the particular dynamics this time around. So let's talk about women running for office. With that gender gap information in the background, we thought 2016 was going to be a different kind of election. Here are your 44 presidents. They do share one thing in common. Their chromosomes, all the same, all men. This was to be the first election of a woman to the White House. Did not happen, but it did motivate some research early in the season, and that's what I get to share with you tonight. The story in the US Congress is a little bit different. There actually have been a number of women elected to Congress, most of them in recent years. Today, women occupy about 20% of seats in both the House and the Senate, but that's a recent phenomenon really limited to the last 20 or 25 years. So you may remember 1992 being called the Year of the Woman, a large uptick then, and continuing increases since then, but women still remain vastly underrepresented given that they're actually a majority of the electorate. But you see the differences here. 0 women elected to the presidency, now about 1 in 5 members of Congress female, and in fact a former Speaker of the House female. So that's going to guide some of the experiments you'll see in a moment where we have expectations about how voters view candidates running for president differently than how they view candidates who are running for Congress. So here's a question. With a woman on the ticket in 2016, might she have expected actually to get a bonus from the fact that she was female? Is there an affinity of female voters for female candidates? We sometimes hear that as a kind of folk wisdom, that women voters, not having other factors that would decide their vote, might use the sex of the candidate as a deciding factor. On this, actually, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were in some agreement. They both thought that being female was a bonus. They said it in different ways, but they agreed. So here's Donald Trump back in April. This was the night of one of his victories. Rather than giving a victory speech, he spent some time on other issues, as he sometimes does. This was one of his comments. Frankly, if Hillary Clinton were a man, I don't think she'd get 5% of the vote. The only thing she's got going for her is the women's card. He's saying she gets a big bonus for being a woman. It's a sympathy vote or gender affinity or something else, and that's what's keeping this close. If she were a man, I would easily be ahead in the campaign. Hillary Clinton embraced that comment, began raising money by issuing women's cards that you could buy with a donation to the campaign. Within about 3 days, she had raised, I think, $2.5 million from these cards. So she didn't run away from the idea that she was a female candidate and that marked her as different. She tried to embrace it and use it in a year that was wrapped up in change and wanting something different. Part of her message was, I'm different. I'm not like those other 44 men who have occupied the office, and I'm happy to be a female seeking higher office. The other reason we might have expected women to gravitate towards Clinton this year are actions and statements by Donald Trump that may have pushed them away. Women being repelled by Trump. I'm not going to go through the litany, but I'm going to remind you of just a few of the things that happened over the course of the campaign that might have set women away. This was a comment of Trump's during one of the early primary debates where Carly Fiorina, the businesswoman from Hewlett-Packard, was on the stage. He says, look at that face. Why would anyone vote for that? I mean, she's a woman, and I'm not supposed to say bad things, but really, folks, come on. Insulting her appearance. To Megyn Kelly, about Megyn Kelly, you remember this comment. You could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her whatever. That comment actually got used in a Hillary Clinton ad at the end of the campaign. When interviewed just before the Wisconsin primary by Chris Matthews, he was Donald Trump was asked about his opinions on abortion. He's pro-life in this campaign and was asked what would happen if a woman got an abortion. Should the woman be punished? And he says there has to be some form of punishment. He was criticized for that. And then the most famous was the tape that was revealed from his conversations on Access Hollywood just a couple weeks before the election about the kind of aggressive assault he would use on women, kissing them, grabbing them without their permission. All of those things you might think would be offensive to a number of women voters. Women are a large, diverse group, but many of them would find these things unacceptable in a presidential candidate or a president, and you might think would be drawn away, maybe not to Hillary Clinton, but away from Donald Trump. And that might create that Grand Canyon of a gender gap. Not so much. Could it be that there's something about a woman running as a candidate that dampens the effect of these kinds of scandalous statements? Is it the case that the public supports seeing a female president, or they have some reluctance about it? Well, fortunately, there have been a number of surveys over the years asking the public whether they support the idea of a woman running for president, being president. These surveys go back to the 1940s, so we have decades of data tracking them over time. I'm going to show you first a couple of questions that have been asked by two different survey firms. The orange dots are by Gallup, and the lighter yellow dots by the General Social Survey, which is an academic survey. Both of them have a version of the question asking, essentially, if your party nominated a woman who was qualified for the office, would you vote for her? Would you be willing to vote for her? In the 1940s and 50s, half of the electorate said, no, even if she's of my party, even if she's qualified, I would not vote for a woman for president. There's obviously been tremendous improvement in this measure over time. By today, we're at over 90%, perhaps 95% of the electorate saying that, of course, they would support a female for the presidency if she were qualified and of their party. So this suggests that the bias against female candidates, which was once gigantic, has essentially gone away. Almost no one says they would not vote for a female candidate, but there are reasons to be doubtful. And one reason is this other question that has been asked in recent years by CNN in their polls. The question is, do you think America is ready for a female president or not? Not you. We know that you're ready. You've just told us. But do you think America is ready, those other people? When you ask the question in this way, you get somewhere between 60% and 80% saying America is ready. Now, maybe we all have misperceptions of everyone else's biases and we think we don't have them. Or maybe some of us have biases against particular kinds of candidates, but we don't want to reveal them to the survey researcher because it's embarrassing and it violates social norms. So how does one then figure out whether there are actual biases in the electorate against or for a female candidate if you can't ask them directly? Well, this is where the science of political science comes in. I'm going to show you a couple of experiments we've conducted that try to get at the true attitudes of voters towards female candidates without being obvious about it. We're going to do this in an unobtrusive way that allows people to tell us what they really think without outing themselves, without violating social norms. So 2 experiments. Let me talk about the first. This is a version of something known as the list experiment. The list experiment is a research design, a protocol that's been used in survey research to ask people about sensitive items. Items where we think we might not get the truth in a regular survey. Things like drug use, racial attitudes, domestic abuse, those kinds of things where we think the attitude is important enough that we want to measure it, but we don't believe that we'd get honest responses if we asked. So here's how it works. People are taking a survey. In this case, it was in March 2016. We interviewed about 1,700 Americans. This is a nationally representative sample. It's an internet sample, but it's weighted in a way to match the census demographics of the country. In the course of the other questions people are asked, they stumble upon this introduction to a new set of questions. The following statements sometimes make people angry or upset. Please carefully read all of the statements and indicate how many of them upset you. You do not need to indicate which ones. So we're now going to give you a list of items. You don't need to tell us which ones of those bother you, just how many of the list. Give us a number, and we're going to randomize the order of them so you don't catch on that we care about some of them more than others. Half of the sample is going to be randomly selected to get these 4 items. Gas prices going up, professional athletes getting $1 million+ salaries, requiring seatbelts when driving, large corporations polluting the environment. You can think about how many of those you would say. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 0. Again, not which ones, just how many. So half the sample gets that list and the order is randomized. The other half of the sample gets this list plus one more, a woman serving as president. Again, randomized order. We don't think we're tipping them off. This is just in the mix. It's in a longer survey that's about a bunch of other things. Now, the nice thing is because we've randomized whether you get the short list or the long list, we know what the average number reported is for the short list and the average number of things that upset you in the long list. The difference between the two has to be the number of people who have said, it bothers me with the idea of a woman being president. That's it. If you think that respondents have figured out what we're up to, that they see that and it just sort of stands out as different, they might change their opinions or not give us the truth. If that's the case, we're actually underestimating how much bias there is against a woman being president. Okay, so you think about what your expectations are. I'm going to show you the results. So in the short list of the 4 items, the average respondent said that 2.17 of them were making them upset or angry. In the long list, it was a higher number, 2.30. That's a difference of 0.126 or 12.6%. So that's one answer to the question, what share of the American electorate is biased against a female candidate seeking the presidency? In the list experiment, it's 13%. Now, those percentages are not uniform across the electorate. You'll see that we've broken out various demographic groups. We can look at the percentages among them. For example, among men, in the short list, the number is 2.03. In the long list, it's 2.29 for a difference of 26%. So among men, the bias is twice as large. Among women, the bias is 0. Female voters show no bias for or against having a woman run for president or serve as president, whereas men show a bias of about 26 percentage points. There's some other groups there. Some of these we have more confidence about than others. Some of those lines, the rows, don't have as many respondents in them as we might like, so don't get too attached to any one number. But the patterns sort of follow what you might expect. People without a college degree show somewhat more bias than people with a college degree. Somewhat surprisingly, young voters show more bias against female candidates than older voters. African American and Latino respondents show more bias than white voters. So not all the patterns conform with our expectations. And these aren't controlling for all of the other factors simultaneously. These are just raw differences. One question that sometimes comes up is maybe respondents were not thinking about a woman in the White House generically. Maybe they were thinking about Hillary Clinton in the White House. She was the one in the news and the one most likely to be the next occupant of the White House. So maybe this is what they're thinking about. Well, it turns out in the survey, we asked people their opinions of Hillary Clinton separately in a long battery that asked about a variety of political figures. We can control for that, and we still see this effect. So it seems as though this really is a generic concern about a woman serving as president and not at least solely about Hillary Clinton specifically. So this is experiment 1, list experiment. The answer you get is 13%. Let me talk about experiment 2. This is a different design, something known as a conjoint experiment. This is a design that's been used in marketing for years. Marketing companies, producers often want to test products before an audience with different attributes. So they will bring people into a focus group or into a laboratory and show them many versions of a product with different features, and then see what combination of attributes the consumer is most attracted to. So if you were selling televisions, you might bring people into a lab and show them a television that's 40 inches and is a flat screen and has some smart technology, and you might then show them another television that's 32 inches and has the ability to stream video or something else. And you just show enough of those things and you can get a good sense for exactly what combination consumers are interested in. Well, we decided to use that methodology when thinking about political candidates. What if we were to bring people into the survey experiment and show them a bunch of different kinds of candidates where we vary their attributes and see which candidates they end up picking? The attribute we're most interested in is the sex of the candidate, whether they're male or female, but we can vary, in fact, all of the attributes in this environment. So this is one example of what respondents in this experiment would see. They would be presented with 2 hypothetical candidates and given information about them that they would normally encounter in the course of a high-profile campaign. We tell them the sex of the candidate, the age, their position on an important issue, the areas of expertise they focus on, their position on abortion, their favorability rating, a variety of things I think would normally come up in the course of campaign coverage or voters learning about candidates. The one we're interested in is the very first row. In this case, this one example, candidate 1 is male, candidate 2 is female. They differ in age, they differ in experience in office, their race, their party. The wonderful thing about this experiment is that all of these attributes are varied randomly. Every respondent in our survey is going to see 10 pairings of candidates, and in each case asked, which of these people would you vote for? If this is what you knew about them, who would you vote for? Because we're randomly varying all of the attributes simultaneously, we know exactly what effect any one attribute has, because everything else has been controlled statistically. Half of the 10 sets they will see, they're told these are people running for president. The other half, they're told these are people running for Congress. Otherwise, it's just a random mix. So what happens when you do this? You get this complicated plot. I'm going to explain what's happening here. Here are all the attributes we varied. These match up with these categories: positions, experience, race, family. You see those all here: family, race, party, experience in office. The circles you see are the point estimates from a regression analysis. The point tells us whether having that attribute is a net positive, that would be to the right of the zero line, or a net negative. So in this case, this is the sex of the candidate. When the candidate is female, this dot indicates she gets about 2.5 percentage points less in the vote. This line indicates the confidence interval around that point. It doesn't overlap 0, so we would say it's statistically significant. Okay, so here's another estimate. I've given you one estimate from the list experiment that says 13% of the electorate is angry or upset by the idea of a woman in the White House, and that varies somewhat across different kinds of voters. Now I'm showing you that when we actually present people with two hypothetical candidates, randomly varying attributes about their backgrounds, women get about 2.5 percentage points less in the vote than male candidates when everything else is controlled. This would have been enough, I think, for a candidate like Hillary Clinton to have won Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania had that bias not been there. There were many other things at work in the campaign. This is but one. Anytime there's a close election, we can point to 100 factors that could have been different. Most of the other factors turn out the way you'd expect. For example, candidates who have lower favorability ratings tend to get less of the vote. Candidates who are, what are the ones I like? Candidates who are older get less in the way of the vote. Candidates who are from minority groups often get less in the way of the vote. So there are some other patterns that are interesting, but this is the one we zeroed in on. 2.5 percentage point disadvantage for being a female candidate. We can also look at these effects across different kinds of respondents. So 2.5 percentage points is the average effect, but if we look at it separately for men and women, you'll see there's a difference. For men, the effect is just about that, 2.5 or 3 percentage points. But for women, the effect is not statistically significant. So this is sort of like the result I showed you from the list experiment. Women don't seem to be biased for or against female candidates. In other words, there's no evidence of gender affinity. It doesn't look like female voters are voting for female candidates at higher rates. In fact, this point is a little bit left of 0. It's just not significant. No difference. But it looks like men like male candidates. That's actually what's happening. It's not women being attracted to female candidates. It's men being attracted to male candidates that causes this to happen. So it looks like there is a gender affinity. The other interesting thing here is the difference between Republicans, Democrats, and independents in the electorate. Democrats actually show slight favorability towards female candidates. It's a positive effect. It's not statistically significant, but it's certainly not negative. Republicans show about the average, about 2.5 percentage points. And it's actually independents that show the largest bias against female candidates. Why is that? Our answer is that Republicans and Democrats have partisanship to lean on. I know as a Republican or Democratic voter, if I vote for a candidate of my party, they're very likely to do the things in office I'd like them to do. Their race, experience, favorability ratings, or their gender don't much matter. Partisanship is going to be 90% of what happens. But if you're an independent, you don't have partisanship as a cue. You have to rely on something else. And in those situations, the characteristics of the candidates become really important. And we think this is a really important lesson more generally. Whenever elections are decided by something other than partisanship, the character traits, the background characteristics of candidates are going to become more important. So that would be the case in nonpartisan elections, like mayoral elections in Madison, or in primaries where all the candidates are of the same party, and so that's neutralized. In those cases, the traits become more important. For independents, that's the case in every election. Because they don't favor a party, the sex of the candidate becomes important, and women face a bigger penalty among them than among other voters. I also mentioned that we did this experiment 5 times for a hypothetical presidential candidate and then 5 times for a congressional candidate. The effect only exists in presidential elections. About 3 percentage points there, no effect in congressional elections. And we think this is consistent with the evidence I showed you earlier. Never has a woman been elected president. Only once has a woman been nominated by her party, and she failed to win the election. In Congress, it's not hard for voters to imagine a female member of Congress. Many voters have had a female member of Congress represent them, either in the House or the Senate. The Speaker of the House has been female. It requires less imagination. But there's evidence that voters are reluctant to take actions when there's uncertainty, and imagining what a woman in the White House would do creates that uncertainty and causes some voters to shy away. This is like research that's been done on mayoral elections around the country, where a black candidate and a white candidate face off for the first time to be mayor. In those instances, the black candidate is often penalized. They get less of the vote. But the second time it happens, there's no penalty. The black candidate and the white candidate are on equal grounds, all else constant. So the good news from the 2016 election might be that Hillary Clinton as a candidate has now paved the way for a female candidate for president being a normal thing. And I would expect this bias maybe not to go to 0, but to be decreased in the way the bias against congressional candidates has over time. Okay, let me show you one more thing, and then I'm going to be happy to take questions. And this is the thing I want to show you. Many of you have seen websites like Upshot or Pollster or 538 that track the polls on a daily basis. Many of you were clicking and refreshing those sites throughout the campaign. We thought it would be interesting to go back and have a look at those polls, but to separate them for men and women. That's what this graph does. These are all the polls conducted in the last 200 days of the campaign, where men and women are reported separately their preferences for Trump and Clinton. A positive number here means that for a particular point means that those people preferred Clinton over Trump, so there was a positive Democratic vote. Negative means a Republican vote. Here's the traditional gender gap. Women are mostly on Clinton's side throughout the campaign. Men are mostly on Trump's side, though somewhat less so throughout the campaign. This final difference between the two is just about 13 points, which is what I showed you in the exit polls at the beginning of the talk. The question is how we got there and whether the gender gap widened and shrunk in ways that advantage particular candidates. There are a couple of surprising things. One is these data run against the folk wisdom that women are the persuadable voters and that men have made decisions and can't be swayed from one side to the other. That both parties are going after the female vote. In fact, it's men who are wiggling around more during the campaign than are women. The standard deviation of these points is about 5.5. The standard deviation of these points is about 6.5. Okay, so it's men who are more volatile. And they're volatile in some unexpected ways. So let me show you some of the events here. This is Hillary Clinton's worst week on the campaign. She made the comment about the basket of deplorables, which offended some Trump voters. And just a day or two later, she had a pneumonia scare on September 11th and was taken away in a van and went off the campaign trail for a few days. Women voters don't seem to have reacted much to that. Their support for her is about what it was before. There aren't a lot of polls. It's a little noisy, but about the same. But it looks like those events pushed men away from her and towards Trump. And so that overall lowered her poll ratings, right? And made things more difficult for her. Men then begin moving back in Clinton's direction. Here's the first debate, which everyone agrees Clinton won. Here's the release of the Access Hollywood tape in the second debate, which almost happened simultaneously. Again, you might think that would draw women away from Trump and towards Clinton. It did not. Women cruised through those events with really no change. But men moved decidedly in Clinton's direction. This is the biggest movement of the campaign. This is now a point where men are actually on Clinton's side. There's still a gender gap, but it's smaller, and both men and women are voting for Clinton in mid-October. So contrary to the folk wisdom that a bigger gender gap might help the Democrats, here's a case where the smallest gender gap during the campaign was at Clinton's height in the polls. This was when they were talking about landslides and winning by double digits and picking up 40 states or something. That holds through the third debate, which most people agree she also won. Again, very high ratings among men. The gap is very small. But then right at the end, here's Jim Comey's letter saying that the emails were going to be looked at again, that some messages from Anthony Weiner were discovered on someone else's laptop. And that seems to have given men reason maybe to buy into an earlier narrative that they were interested in and moved away from Clinton. And it's that last minute movement that tipped the Electoral College. So clear gender effects as part of the larger campaign message. So with that, let me stop, and I would love to take your questions. Thanks for sticking with me. So I'll call on folks. Yes, sir.
You wait for the microphone.
Can you go? Oh, sorry, let's wait for the mic, and I'm going to make sure to speak into the mic also.
You alluded to this, but briefly, and that is, how much of this gender gap do you think was unique to Hillary Clinton? Had there been another woman candidate without the baggage that she brought, without the emails, without some of this stuff, might a different woman candidate have fared better?
It's a great question. These are things to wonder about late at night. What if there were a different female candidate? I think our evidence suggests that not very much of this was Hillary Clinton specific, that there's a pretty significant ongoing bias among voters against female candidates. In the list experiment I showed, it was 13 percentage points, and that mostly held even after we accounted for people's attitudes towards Hillary Clinton specifically. I think her baggage did open up some opportunities for the Trump campaign. The Comey letter happening at the end of the campaign would not have had the same effect on a different kind of candidate. There's actually an interesting counterfactual here. What if the Access Hollywood tape had been released on October 28th and the Comey letter had happened in early October? She would have taken a hit early but would have rebounded. Then Access Hollywood drops 10 days before the election. My guess is she would be president-elect rather than Trump. So there's this kind of random ordering of things during the campaign that end up having these kinds of effects. The other interesting counterfactual is, what if Bill Clinton rather than Hillary Clinton was the candidate this year? My hunch is he would have won the election, in part because he was male and in part because he didn't have the email baggage and the other things that Trump made so much of. But these, in the end, these are really tough questions to answer, but really important ones.
Were you surprised with the results of the marriage family question and then the economic class question? I wasn't so much with the family. I expected the divorce to really be a negative, but with respect to the class issue, the lower and middle getting really low and the upper getting the above.
So you're asking about the list experiments? Yeah, here were the results. So overall it was 13%, but there are some funny differences across groups. Yeah, so the class question, these are where some of the results are upside down from what you might expect. Yeah, not all of these adhere to, I think, our expectations. Upper, middle, and upper class voters show a larger bias than lower or middle class voters do. I think it's just as surprising that younger voters show a larger bias than older voters, given attitudes about gender changing over the course of generations. Voters in the South show no bias. Voters outside the South show a 19 percentage point bias. Again, some of these, I wouldn't put too much weight on the specific number because the sample sizes do vary from one row to another, but something we want to make sense of. I think I trust the results from the conjoint experiment more because that's a multivariate analysis where we're accounting for all of these characteristics simultaneously. This is really looking at one group after another.
That was the one that caught the attention. Yes, right there. That was really so much surprise.
So a lot of these effects are not statistically significant. Anytime this line, horizontal line, crosses the 0 bar, there's no effect. So what were you thinking about?
The single married, one child, and then back down to the class issue.
Yeah, so these are all effects compared to a candidate who's never been married. So a candidate who's married with 2 children appears to get a little bit of a bonus. Voters sort of like that, but it's not statistically significant. And then voters who are married without children or are divorced, looks like they pay a little penalty, but again, not statistically significant. Yeah, they're interesting. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Do I read this one and the list correctly that the South had less bias than the non-South?
You do. What do we make of that? In this case, it's the South. Where is this? We don't have it here, do we? No, it was only in the list experiment, not in the conjoint experiment. So, the question is, what makes the South different from the rest of the country? It's more racially diverse when it comes to the share of African Americans in the population. It has lower levels of education and income. There are things that make the South distinct demographically. And I think one trouble with the list experiment is we can't take account of all those things simultaneously. The thing that's wonderful about the list experiment is also its hang-up. We don't know how any one individual responded. What we know is in the aggregate, we get 13% telling us they're angry or upset. We can look at some subcategories, but we can't do them all simultaneously because then we're essentially getting down to individuals again, and that is impossible. So we can't know for sure. My guess is that some of the South, non-South difference is actually other things at work, and were we to control for those surprising effects might go away.
Back one slide. We've got a Republican that wants to increase taxes and a Democrat that wants to decrease spending. I understand that you're just sort of scrambling everything all over the place, but these are really weird candidates. Don't people say, where do you find these fake people?
Right, so this is a knock on conjoint experiments that we have to think seriously about. Is this realistic enough? Are respondents taking this task seriously? Do they view these as possible candidates in the real world? And when we ask them to vote in this hypothetical election, are they choosing in a meaningful way? I think so, even though sometimes the combinations seem nonsensical. We have done separate analyses where we pull out the non-stereotypic candidates. So if you have an African-American Republican who wants to cut taxes, who, sort of combinations you just don't see in the real world very often, and the effects still hold. But we're reluctant to do very much of that engineering of the data because it's us imposing our ideas about what candidates ought to look like. And that kind of undermines the randomness of the experiment. But either way we do it, we still see the effect. Other questions?
One of the discussion points from this election is the number of people who did not vote. Have you considered gender differences and tried to model them with the people who did not vote, or also the millennials, and trying to get them to vote and what you could find about them?
Yeah, it's a great question. Non-voters are actually the largest group, larger than Trump voters, larger than Clinton voters. Women turned out at a healthy rate this time around. That was not the issue. In fact, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, and it was in part due to female voters who made up 53 or 54% of the electorate. Not very much different from 2012. That's not the case with other demographic groups. We don't have great data yet, but the exit polls indicate that young voters turned out at somewhat lower rates than in 2012, and African Americans turned out at lower rates than in 2012. Those were key parts of Obama's coalition that elected him in 2 consecutive elections. They didn't turn out in the same way in 2016. We don't know what the cause of that is. Is that something about the Clinton campaign strategy that didn't mobilize them in the same way? Is her personal appeal wasn't the same as Obama's appeal to those groups? Is it resources not being devoted to those groups? Is it them being indifferent between Clinton and Trump? I think those are all questions we still have to ask. But I think those are the 2 most likely culprits in what flipped some of these Midwestern states. It's those key demographic groups who are not independently large shares of the electorate, but in 2008 and 2012 were so overwhelmingly Democratic in their vote that to take away even a small number of them really hurts the Democratic candidate. You want to follow up on that? Can we? Well, either she wants to follow up or you can catch both of them if you want.
Thank you. I actually had a question about the early 90s because I was 4 years old, so I don't remember. But could you have predicted the increase in women in Congress, for instance, at that time? Or were there a series of events, or did you know it was coming?
Did I know it was coming was a different question. Could we have seen it coming? Yeah, I think so. So, where do women in Congress come from? They come from lower office. Where do any candidates come from? Typically lower office. We have what's called a progression or a hierarchy of offices in the US that really exists in a way it doesn't in other democracies. We expect people to run for school board and then state senate and then US Congress and so on. And there had been a field team of women in state legislative offices and municipal offices that had been growing in number. There were some states that had pretty sizable numbers of women in the state legislatures. The 1992 election had a kind of magic to it because there were several things going on at once. One is that it was a redistricting year. So you had a lot of incumbents who had their districts changed or totally removed, and many of them decided to retire. That opened up new seats that women ran for. Second, there was a check bouncing scandal. You wouldn't remember this, but some of you will remember there's a check bouncing scandal in 92 that tarnished some incumbents who decided not to run for re-election or faced really strong opponents. So that again sort of shook up the works. Third was it was a good year for Democrats. And good years for Democrats tend to be good years for women because women candidates are disproportionately in the Democratic Party. So all of those things sort of working together helped push women into office. And it's been a continual improvement since then, but it's in fits and starts.
With the expanded access through early voting, particularly in the Madison area, will there be a way to analyze your data for the consistency of the results between the people who voted at the polling place on election day versus early voting?
This is a great question about early voting. This is one of the mysteries of 2016. Early voting around the country was up this year, probably a record high. Some early indications are maybe 40% of the electorate voted early, compared to a third of the electorate in the last two elections. In Wisconsin, we definitely set new records for early voting. And from states where we have some good data, places like Florida and North Carolina, it was disproportionately women who were voting early. So this made the Clinton campaign extremely confident. Not only had they led in essentially every poll through the summer and fall, but once the voting got underway, it looked like the voters were leaning Democratic, that they were more women than men, more Latino than non-Latino, and it was sort of working in their favor. But none of that materialized on election day. And this is other research of mine I'd be happy to talk about afterwards. There really is no relationship between the amount of early voting that happens and overall turnout. In Wisconsin, early voting was up this year. Turnout was down. It was the lowest turnout in Wisconsin in 20 years. Early voting was up nationwide, but turnout was not up. It was flat from 2012. And the kinds of people who vote early, in this case it was more women than men, that's offset by what happens on election day, which looks like was probably more men than women. We will eventually have data on who voted when and be able to back all of that out and try to make sense of it. It's possible that the Clinton campaign got sort of giddy or overconfident about how they were doing during early voting and didn't have the same kind of push on election day that other campaigns traditionally have, or it's just other kinds of things that were maybe outside the campaign's control. It's a great question we don't quite have the answer to just yet. I'm told we can take two more questions. Yes, go right ahead.
Is there a way to extrapolate the women in Congress data to predict how many presidential cycles it'll take for the gender gap to disappear?
Also a great question. I think the answer is no, because presidential candidates comes from such a variety of places. Two of the places we can look are governorships or the US Senate. Those are the two most common places for presidential candidates to come from. And we've actually seen a fair number of women now running for the presidency. People like Michelle Bachmann, Elizabeth Dole, Hillary Clinton. It's not what we might expect given their share of the population, but it's been increasing. I think we're going to continue to, Carly Fiorina will continue to see that. Can you project out? I think not. It's such a thin population of people who pursue that office that it's really difficult to say that in 2024 or in 2028 will be the year that a woman gets the nomination or wins the presidency. But I think we can say that from every year out from here, that the likelihood will be increasing and will become more of a regularity rather than an exception. And a last question. Yes.
You said something interesting about how governors, like black governors, win the second time one runs than the first time. But then Obama. So is there any explanation why, like, what the difference between like the polarization with the first black president and like a woman, like the difference there?
Yeah, wow, is that a great question? So how is it that bias against a female candidate hurt Hillary Clinton and maybe cost her the election, but bias against an African American candidate didn't stop Barack Obama from winning 2 elections? I think there's a complicated answer to that. One answer is that Barack Obama had other things helping him along that helped him overcome those biases. Initially running in 2008, when the economic collapse really ruined George Bush's brand and was very likely to elect almost any Democrat who was running at that point, he also ran an amazing campaign. Well-organized, data-driven, focused on face-to-face contact with voters and mobilizing the vote. There are other studies, not mine, but other studies by political scientists showing that voters, that at least some voters, are biased against candidates of color, and that would have hurt Barack Obama. But he was helped by such enthusiasm among young people and among African American voters. 2008 was probably the first election in American history where black turnout either met or exceeded turnout among whites, and 2012 repeated it. It now looks like 2016 has reversed that back to where it was before the Obama elections. So I think there are some things that are specific to those 2 elections that made it possible for Obama to win, despite there being biases against non-white candidates. Hillary Clinton was unfortunate to be in a year when the election was close, when the forecasting models I showed told us it was going to be close, and that all of those factors turned out to be important. Okay, I think we're at our end. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me.